But we're going to go ahead and get started. We do have a ton of questions and a lot to get through. So thank you so much for joining us. My name is Alyssa Taylor. I'm MJV's program coordinator. I'm joined today by my coworker, Jenna Tots, who will be working in the tech end on the back end of the spectrum here. So if you have any tech issues, you can reach out to her. But welcome to our Ask an Expert, a conversation with Dr. Karen Oberhauser and Dr. Anurag Agrawal. We at the Monarch Joint Venture, our mission is to protect monarchs and their migration by collaborating with partners to deliver habitat conservation, education, and science across the monarch range. So if you are curious about the Monarch Joint Venture, Jenna will probably be dropping a link in the chat for you to explore us further if you have not heard of us before. We do want to thank our experts today for their time and knowledge and support of this webinar. We appreciate their dedication, of course, to monarch conservation and research and being able to share all of their knowledge with us in this very short period of time. And we'd like to thank you all for joining us, taking the time to write thoughtful questions and providing us with a lot to think about and see. We know that we're not going to be able to get through all of our questions today. We had quite a few registrants and a lot of questions. So we do recognize that we won't be able to get to everything today. So we did our best to kind of search through the questions across a variety of topics and depths. So we'll get to quite a bit, but we won't get to everything. On the other end of that spectrum, Jen and I will work on the other side of the follow-up to send you some resources. So questions that we have some answers to, we'll make sure that we get resources to you in the follow-up email as well. The layout for today is basically for the first hour or so of the session today, we are going to answer questions that were submitted when you registered. So those questions that you typed in, we'll be going through those today. And then the kind of last half hour, we'll have an opportunity, especially as you're learning and kind of taking the information in today from Karen and Anurag, you'll have the opportunity to use the Q&A box that will be at the bottom of your screen. And what we will ask is if you'd like to ask a question directly, live and unmute to either Karen or Anurag or both of them, that you can put live and then you can note that and write your question. So Jenna will be monitoring that Q&A and then we'll have that space at the end. So we have lots of stuff going on today and hope that you'll be able to enjoy that aspect of this. We did want to just give you a few other learning opportunities that are available if you're interested. You can check out the Monarch Joint Ventures Monarch Conservation Webinar Series. This is a free, happens the third Tuesday of each month. So we are dangerously close to halfway through the year already. But there are a ton of great learning opportunities. So please feel free to register for any of those. They are also all recorded and on our website, so you can go back and reference those as well. And joining us by joining us today too, we also have some opportunities through the Monarch Nectar Hub. Those are either live courses or self-paced courses. And because you're joining us today, you also get a promo code for 20% off one of our learning courses. So please feel free to use that. Jenna's going to put that info in the chat. It'll also be in our follow-up email, but please feel free to use that. We have a really kind of diverse offering so far, and we're continuing to grow it. So if you're interested in those things, please feel free. And then if you are interested further in supporting monarch conservation efforts, you are already supporting those efforts by joining us today, asking your thoughtful questions, and being part of monarch conservation. But if you're interested in supporting further and having more free learning opportunities, please consider making a donation to either the Monarch Joint Venture or the Monarch Butterfly Fund. Dr. Karen Oberhauser is on the board of the Monarch Butterfly Fund, and their mission is to foster conservation of North American monarch butterflies and their migration through habitat conservation, research, monitoring, education, and support for sustainable community development in and near monarch habitats in Mexico. Sorry, little fumble on that one. But please feel free to look those up. Jen will drop the links in it, or at least learn more about some of these organizations. Lots of great organizations out there supporting monarch work. So please consider that. A few community guidelines and expectations as we kind of get started here. This webinar is going to be recorded. I already said that. It will likely be on our website by Friday of this week. We will send you the link in our follow-up email, so no worries if you don't get to the website. As I said before, use the Q&A box. We're not going to be using the chat. We're going to be using the Q&A. It's easier for us to monitor your questions and then get them back out to our experts here. So if you do want to ask a question live in the last 30 minutes, put live in all caps at the beginning of your question, and then type in your question, and hopefully we'll be able to get to some of those. I will call on you and you can unmute and ask your question directly if you're still on the call. You can also feel free to use reactions during the presentation. They're at the bottom of your screen as well. Just if you don't want to unmute, you don't want to have your camera on, no problem at all. Speakers can see those, so it's nice to have that interaction. The other thing is, if you'd like, we do have translated captions on this Zoom call. So if you want to add captions in a language other than English, you can click the arrow on the bottom in captions and you can select the language of your choice for that as well. And two more things, and then I'm going to get out of here. I'm going to turn it over to Karen and Anurag. But if you'd like to adjust your view so you're not seeing the full gallery view for all of our participants today, in the upper right corner, you should see a section called View. You can select Speaker View, and that means whoever's talking is going to be the one that is mainly on your screen, or multi-speaker view. So if there's multiple people talking, those would be the people on the screen. So you have a few options for whatever is most comfortable for you. And then last but not least, all of our speakers today represent their own viewpoints, which are not necessarily those of the Monarch Joint Venture. So representing themselves today. And now, last but not least, I'll introduce our speakers, and I'll get out of here and let them share their expertise with you. So first is Dr. Karen Oberhauser. She's the founder of Monarchs in the Classroom and director emerita of the UW-Madison Arboretum. With decades of experience leading monarch research and citizen science efforts, she has dedicated her career to understanding monarch population trends and engaging communities in conservation. Her work bridges rigorous science with education and outreach, making her a champion for both monarchs and the people who protect them. So welcome to Karen. And we also have wonderful Dr. Anurag Agrawal, is a professor at Cornell University and the author of Monarchs and Milkweed, a groundbreaking book that explores the evolutionary relationship between monarch butterflies and their host plants. His research focuses on plant and insect interactions, chemical ecology, and the ecological dynamics that shape monarch populations. Through his scientific leadership, Dr. Agrawal brings a deeper understanding of the complex natural systems monarchs depend upon. So just thank you guys so much for joining us. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that folks can see everybody. As you can tell, we have two wonderful folks on the call today to answer your questions. But I'm going to kind of give a quick softball question. Maybe it might be softball. I don't know. We're going to start it out for each of you. If you could please share what you think is the coolest thing about monarchs. I'll let you guys pick who goes first.
Karen, you're on.
So the coolest thing about monarchs, I'm going to talk about the coolest thing for me about studying monarchs. And it really, I have a couple answers to that question. And part of it is just the amazing group of people here. Today, those of you who I know, I've just enjoyed working with you so much over the years. So Cece Cope, you're right on the bottom of my screen right now. So my gosh, I can't believe you're here. I've known you for about 25 years. So yeah, all the people I've met in so many different contexts working with monarchs has been great. What I love about the monarchs themselves is all of the different habitats and behaviors they have. So I've studied monarchs in Minnesota and Wisconsin and Texas and California and Mexico, and they're very different in all of those places. I think a lot about eggs and caterpillars and also the adults. So I just love the diversity of all the different things there are to study. And finally, I'm super interested in tachinid flies. So I like thinking about the natural enemies of monarchs as well. So there's a really long answer to your softball question, Alyssa.
I knew it's a softball in theory, but not for you guys. How are you, Anurag?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say, I love the organisms, both monarchs and milkweeds, and um, I guess the thing I'd say is they still, I've studied them for about 25 years, still present to me these mysteries and that change my opinion about things, and I go back and forth, and I don't really, I mean, I guess the example I'll give is early on, I was teaching at the University of Toronto, and I was, in downtown eating my lunch in like a little mini garden, and there was a, 5 foot tall Asclepias syriaca, it's common milkweed, and a large monarch caterpillar on it. And it's only once of maybe two or three times that I saw the caterpillar. It was trenching away, and there was a giant droplet of latex, and it drank the droplet of latex. Like it disappeared before my eyes. And I would say that my long held view back then and until very recently is that latex is, a plant's way of defending itself, and the monarch had to get it out of the way. And so it suffered through drinking that droplet of latex. But just a recent study came out that I had nothing to do with that talked about all the benefits, not only benefits, but that the monarchs actively drink latex. And they're so tightly adapted to those plants that I don't know, they keep presenting mysteries to me. And I think the way coevolution works is some of the same things are positive and negative depending on the context or the time, or and I guess even if federal science funding doesn't continue, I'll still be able to ask my questions and think about the things because they present a tremendous sort of scientific complexity to us that is endless hours of fun.
Well, already two great answers to what I considered the softball question. To kick us off, well, once again, thank you guys so much for joining us. We're going to dive into the questions that you all have submitted. I am going to kind of state the name, first and last name, as best as possible, of those that submitted the questions that we're going to be touching on today. So if you'd like to turn your camera on and give a wave, please feel free, but you don't have to do that either. But I do want to give you the option if you'd like to engage that way. So we're going to kick it off with a question from Betty Bakalu. And it's kind of a combination question from quite a few people, to be honest. And Karen, I'll kick it to you first. Does it really make a difference as to what milkweed they eat? And if so, why? There was actually a lot of questions that from Chuck Patterson, who noticed what particular milkweeds that they were going towards compared to others. And same with even somebody in California, Marcia noticing, that they lean towards the narrow leaf as opposed to others. So does it really make a difference as to what they eat and why?
So I can start this, but then Anurag has really done research on this question. Mostly my knowledge is just observation. So I'll do it from the milkweed observer's perspective, and you'll get the real answer from Anurag. So I have observed that monarchs will go to the best looking milkweed. And that's going to be different species of milkweed in different locations, different times of the year. So I'm a little nervous about the research that's coming out where people purport to say this milkweed is better than that milkweed. And there's just a new paper that came out on this. And those are common garden experiments where milkweed are a whole bunch of different species are put in the same place. Like there was one study that had poke milkweed plants, and poke milkweed grows in the shade. Jan Sharp knows that, she's here. So they will pick the species that's doing the best in that place at that time. And so I think the health of the milkweed plant is more important to them than chemical composition. Certainly the milkweeds vary in chemical composition. The levels of cardinalides in the plants is variable. But from the monarch's perspective, they want the healthiest plant. And that can have to do, that'll change over the course of the year, one year to another, one edge of a field to the other edge of the field. So the people that say they seem to prefer one kind of plant, that's probably the kind of plant that's best in that habitat in that year. So you can talk more about the details of all those differences, Anurag.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the one thing I would say is that, and I agree with everything you said, the species of milkweed really does matter in terms of whether they like to lay eggs on them, the first 24, 36 hours of performance, the caterpillars, whether they have to shave the hairs or how much latex there is. And, I'd say that there's maybe 4 or 5 studies that show that those milkweeds that they prefer to lay eggs on aren't necessarily the best for larval survivorship. So that in and of itself, I think, presents the complexity that you alluded to, Karen. And as 2 examples of really common species, Asclepias incarnata swamp milkweed and tuberosa, the butterfly weed, they're basically devoid of cardinalides. And I guess it's somewhat debatable how important those toxins are for the monarch's own protection, but they're at least somewhat important. So as super common plant species, monarchs don't gain much protection on them from packing away those poisons, the milkweed poisons. On the other hand, they're relatively, incarnata in particular, relatively easy to eat. It's tall, butterflies lay eggs on them. So I guess I would echo what Karen said. I would caution people from choosing milkweeds to plant based on perceptions of what's best. I mean, there's 130 species in North America of Asclepias that monarchs can develop on to adulthood. And we kind of know some of the worst species, Asclepias linearia from Arizona or Asperula, which is in the southern US. Those are tough milkweeds for monarchs to eat. Their leaves are tough. They're full of poisons that hurt them, and they just have trouble surviving. The really hairy species in the West, they're just Asclepias californica, or monarchs will spend hours shaving those little bald spots. But I'm babbling already. I guess it's complicated. I plant native milkweeds if you want to plant milkweeds, and probably like everything else, diversity is the spice of life. I mean, monarchs in their annual migratory cycle are probably some very large fraction of them, 75% of them across a full 4-generation cycle, are eating common milkweed and Asclepias viridis. I can't remember is it antelope horns, or is that the right common name, Karen? But the other 128 Asclepias species or many of them do often get monarchs, and probably provide their own benefits in certain contexts and certain challenges in those contexts.
I feel like this is going to be a reoccurring theme, that a lot of things are complicated.
It depends.
There's a lot of things that depend. Those are great answers. I think that's super useful to hear and understand. And I think this kind of leans into a little bit, Karen, about what you were saying. And Anna, I'm going to kick it to you first, because there were a couple people that asked this. Is it helpful to prune milkweed to stimulate new growth? It's kind of twofold. One, in a certain time frame as it's beginning to senesce. That was from Carolyn Smith. And then folks that just heard that if you trim it, it's better for monarchs. So Dina Robinson had asked that. So a lot about like what if pruning is valuable as it relates to the monarchs and how they are interacting with milkweed.
Shall I answer first? I mean, I would say I'm personally a let nature take its course kind of person. And so, when milkweeds come out of the ground and are growing fast and are lush and tender, I think they're very attractive and typically really good food for monarchs. And one thing that's, I think, very true for monarch milkweed interactions and quite general for insect plant interactions is that when we cut them back and they resprout, the plants produce a little bit more of the juvenile foliage, which tends to be a little succulent, a little soft, less hairy. And monarch adults prefer to lay eggs on regrowing, like cut back and regrowing milkweeds. And their performance, I can't remember if I've done this experiment or a student in my lab has, but I'm pretty sure that caterpillar performance is also, growth rate is a little bit higher on, if you have two milkweeds growing next to each other, one that's been cut back and regrowing and one that hasn't been, will be a little bit faster or better on the one that's cut back. So I would say from an ecological perspective, if what you're trying to do is maximize egg laying or rapid caterpillar growth, that cutting them back can do that. I don't believe personally that we should be manipulating fields or even our gardens to that effect to try to improve things or help things, because it also is disrupting in a way the natural cycle. At the end of the season, milkweeds that are tougher and tattered, that are more difficult to eat, as Karen's lab showed, is part of the cues that the caterpillars use to develop into their migratory form, in addition to colder nights and shorter days. But the change in the quality of the milkweed is part of that, stimulating them to produce the migratory generation. So we don't want to disrupt that. So I would say that's my answer.
Yeah, I jump. That was a great answer, and I just jump in. One thing is you're totally right, and everyone notices this, that they'll lay more eggs on newly cut back milkweed, but we don't know if they're laying more eggs in general. If those females that come into those plants are laying more of their full complement of eggs, they're just laying them on those plants. So, it might be there's just less eggs that they're laying on the senescing milkweed out there. So everyone thinks, whoa, this must be so great because I'm seeing so many eggs, but it might not be helping the total number of monarchs out there. The other thing, I see Ann Hobby here. Ann and I, and Liz Gehring is here too. We used to do these classes for teachers. Some of you are here who are in those classes. Hello. One year, a group of teachers did an experiment to answer this very question, and they cut down milkweed plants. Then we came back in a couple weeks, and it was a drought year, and there was no rain in those couple weeks. None of those milkweed plants grew back. So the experiment, they couldn't do that experiment. So if you cut them and then it doesn't rain, you will just have removed a big source of food for the caterpillars. So yeah, I'm a let nature take its course kind of gal too.
Interesting. Those are great, very interesting answers. Like not even thinking about like, oh, cut it back and it doesn't rain and you're in a drought and you're,
Yeah.
huh.
Yeah, I'll just add one
Yeah.
other thing that relates to something Karen said. I think one of the things that I and others have noticed is that on regrowing milkweeds, you'll often get more than one caterpillar, more than one egg laid. Whereas on a mature milkweed plant, I believe that the average number of eggs is one or less, and that monarchs even sense when there's an egg there and avoid that plant. Monarch caterpillars eat eggs of other monarch caterpillars. So there's cannibalism, so only at that stage. And so one thing I think about cutting back milkweeds is if monarchs then lay multiple eggs per stem, that's creating competition and potentially cannibalism. And it's again another one of these things where they kind of have a system to work it out themselves. And when we manipulate it in a way, we don't necessarily know all the consequences.
It's a great
Just
point. Thank you for
think
adding that
that
on.
one little thing, I don't think that monarchs can sense eggs on plants.
Okay.
Certainly in our labs, they'll just like lay hundreds. Um,
Yes.
so I think there are some species of butterflies that can do that, but I don't think we know that about monarchs. Just wanted to jump in. But you maybe know some research other than,
I remember a study, but yeah, I don't, yeah.
okay.
We'll dive into that and look at if for our follow-up resources, see if we can find anything in that regard. So I just said another, like it kind of just, depending on what you are interested in learning, if you're conducting your own experiment or not. That's a great answer. Thank you guys. All right, gonna dive into one last kind of milkweed focused question, and we're gonna kind of scoot to our next topic. This came up quite a bit from quite a few different people. Marcy Hawkins asked this question. Based on current research, what would be the best answer when asked about planting tropical milkweed? And this did come up quite a bit across a few different folks. So either one of you can go for that one and then add on.
Go ahead, Karen.
Yeah, so tropical milkweed, there are a lot of topics that there's a lot of disagreement on, and it was fun looking at all of your questions and seeing, this is another answer of it depends. So I think that in planting milkweed, like we said in the answer to the first question, monarchs can do well on dozens of species of milkweed, and tropical milkweed in and of itself probably isn't that bad for monarchs. But the problem with it is that it grows in places and times that there wouldn't naturally be milkweed growing. So, the problem with planting milkweed in the southern part of the or tropical milkweed in the southern United States is if you water it, then there's milkweed present in a place and time that it's not normally there, so it can mess up the migratory cycle of monarchs. If you plant it in the north, it's going to die. It becomes an annual here. So I think it's actually not as bad a problem in the north. It's beautiful. People love it. But, in my opinion, all the native milkweeds are also beautiful. So why would we want to plant a non-native? But, in terms of its impact on the monarchs, it's can be really bad for them in the southern United States if it's around during the winter time. And so the problem with that, I can't remember the exact question. What is the problem with it? The problem is that if it can pull monarchs out of diapause, and they can stay in the southern United States and lay eggs throughout the winter. So that's one problem, is it messes up their migratory cycle. Another problem is that if it pulls a lot of them out, and the same milkweed plant is growing for many generations of monarchs, many generations of large numbers of monarchs, then you can get disease transmission, particularly OE. So as Anurag said in another answer, they're not evolved as caterpillars to be crowded, to be a lot of them on a single plant. And so they really haven't evolved ways to have defenses against diseases that other ones have. And OE can be brought in by one infected female, and if she lays eggs on a plant that other females lay eggs on, the disease can get transmitted to other females' offspring. So I would say problematic in the south for many reasons, and not as problematic in the north, where it dies back.
I agree completely. I would just add two things. One is, I think it's problematic in California also,
Yeah.
and especially in the years, in the couple of years when there were the lowest counts in California, I was getting, many emails of people telling me I'm seeing caterpillars on tropical milkweed in my garden or in my neighborhood. And so I think it's a classic case of disrupting the overwintering in much of California also. Uh, I plant a tropical milkweed or two in my garden as an ornamental. I think um, I like looking at it. I like seeing what the monarchs do on it. I make sure it's not flowering come the end of August. Um, uh, Monarchs in the north are not used to seeing flowers and nectaring on them, and that might be part of what breaks their diapause and messes them up. So I don't know where the cutoff is, latitudinally. Is it North Carolina, Oklahoma, kind of going across? But tropical milkweed is feral, and I think it's fair to call it invasive in the Gulf states, from Florida to Texas to California. I mean, probably not in Arizona, but we don't want to be spreading non-native species that self-seed and are spreading, especially if they're causing problems like this.
Thank you. You actually touched on another question in referencing California there, so that was perfect. Um, all right, so we're gonna kind of switch gears a little bit, and we're gonna talk, which kind of leads into the OE conversation there a little bit. We're talking about predators, parasites, um, threats or natural threats to monarchs. So, um, Karen, I'll start with you. What monarch characteristics originated from coevolution with their natural enemies? And are there any unnatural enemies for monarchs?
So, coevolution is just when what goes on with when a trait in one species influences a trait in another species. And you can get between a predator and a prey, or between an herbivore and the plant, there's going to be coevolution because what happens in one species affects the other one. So pretty much all of the characteristics of monarchs that we're familiar with are influenced by their natural enemies. So their coloration is influenced by their natural enemies because it's bright warning coloration that advertises their toxicity. So the bright orange color is on my t-shirt, or the side of my t-shirt, influenced by their natural enemies. Their behavior is influenced by their natural enemies. If you've ever watched a caterpillar use its silk, the silk that comes from under its chin, and the little caterpillar will fall off of the plant. If you're looking for monarchs, that's a trait that's influenced by natural enemies because it's avoiding predators that are on the plant. So, a lot of what we see, a lot of how they behave is influenced by their natural enemies. And we say, so that's really interesting. Are there any unnatural enemies? So we use the word natural enemy to kind of refer to things that are in nature and not from us. So like I wouldn't call an insecticide a natural enemy, even though it can kill monarchs and it's an enemy. It's not a natural enemy. But I think there's really nothing like worse about an unnatural enemy would be maybe something introduced into the habitat. So there are some tachinid flies that aren't native to the United States that we might call an unnatural enemy, but there are so many that are native that I'm not sure the non-native ones affect them. I don't know. I'd be interested in what you would say. Are there any unnatural enemies that are important to monarchs, Anurag?
I agree completely with what you said. I mean, I guess what I was smiling and I was just thinking, Compsylura, the tachinid that was introduced to control spongy moth, Liomentria dispar, is I think pretty darn abundant in monarchs,
Mm-hmm.
and it's a little shockingly so. As a generalist fly that was introduced to control this other thing. Um, I don't like it, so I'd be happy to call it unnatural. um, I can't remember, Karen, in some of your studies, like, does it show up as it can be pretty darn abundant? Is that right?
Yeah, it can be. And yeah, that's a really interesting one. And we actually, with the MLMP data and having people rear out monarchs that happen to be infected with tachinid flies, That one was introduced in both coasts. So it was introduced on the West Coast and the East Coast, and it's creeping inward. And we had some of the first reports of that, like in Texas. We had people collect monarchs that were parasized by that fly. It doesn't, for those of you waiting, why aren't they going to say a common name? Tachinid flies, none of them have any common names, but Consolura concinata is
Exactly. Yeah.
its species name. So yeah, I don't know if that, yeah, I can't think of an example. I like that question. I can't really think of an example of an unnatural enemy that's had a big effect on monarchs. They have plenty of natural native enemies.
I had
Oh,
one.
well, no, I know the sorry to jump in, the um multicolored Asian ladybug that's introduced. And that is an important natural enemy. I'm not sure they've had time to evolve against it, but it's so common and it definitely eats eggs and little caterpillars.
I was just going to turn to the first part of the question, and I was interested in your thoughts on this, Karen. I'd say like my reading of the literature is indicates that both the coloration and the toxicity, the sequestration of milkweed toxins, is mostly targeted at vertebrate predators, birds, lizards, mice, and that by and large, parasitoids like these tachinids, stink bugs, spiders, other predators are not paying as much attention to either the bright contrasting coloration or the toxicity in the monarch bodies. Is that your read also?
Yeah, and it's a puzzling thing about monarchs. One of my students, Carl Stenoyan, worked on that with a pupal parasitoid, Terra malis, two different species in that genus. And we expected there's a generalist, so we expected the specialists on monarchs to do better. So there are a lot of generalist predators that seem to do fine on monarchs. So yeah, we don't really know why they can do so well. There are some indications that old work by Linda Rayner at Cornell.
Mhm.
She's still there?
Yep, she
Yeah.
is.
So she did interesting work showing that um, the introduced paper wasps preferred less toxic monarchs. So they could somehow distinguish between them. But yeah, a lot of monarchs get eaten by generalist invertebrate
Mhm.
predators.
That was a really great question that came through. That's fantastic question. So Karen, I'm gonna go towards you because you already said that you love them. Well, I don't know if love was the correct word, but that you like studying them. There's a question from Chuck Patterson. It said that they've noticed that on we've noticed more isolated, uh, less dense milkweed patches have fewer tachinid fly infections. Is there any science or research behind that?
So Chuck, thank you for asking that question. And so great to see your name on the list here. Somehow you're not on my screen. So Chuck's a great monarch person in Texas, everybody. Anyway, yes. So they will definitely, tachinid flies will find a patch of milkweed and stay in it. And I just want to tell a little personal story here. I reared a lot of monarchs out of a patch of milkweed in my front yard in Roseville, Minnesota. And it's in a suburban desert with just green lawns all around and not very much close habitat. And one year, every monarch that I reared out of my garden had tachinid flies. So obviously, some tachinid flies had found that patch, and the patch was small enough, and there were few enough monarchs in it that they could find every single monarch caterpillar. So my patch produced no monarchs that year. So they'll definitely, find a patch of milkweed. And if you just think of it from the fly's perspective, if there's this huge, 40-acre, 100-acre prairie out there and these isolated milkweed plants all through it, they're going to have a harder time finding the monarch caterpillars in there. So definitely, if they find a patch, then the next year they didn't find my patch. But if they do, yeah, definitely they'll find those patchy spots of milkweed. Another really cool thing about tachinid flies is and I published a paper on this in like the mid-teens, in a year, a good monarch year, the next year is going to be a good tachinid fly year. So monarchs are kind of driving the tachinid fly numbers. They're a really important host for them. So if you have a good monarch year, the next year there's going to be a lot of tachinid flies around for the monarchs. So that's the one predator or natural enemy I know quite a lot about.
I
Anurag,
don't
do you
know
have
anything.
anything to add?
No, I think that was a great answer. Yeah.
Because Karen loves them so much, or finds
Yeah,
them very interesting.
yeah.
Um, let's put it that way. That's a great answer and another great question. I'm gonna ask one more. It's kind of kind of a broad question, but really interesting. From Stevie Jameson. Anurag, I'll start with you. Can you address how native predation might benefit monarchs in a big picture scenario?
Sure. I mean, I wouldn't use the word benefit, but I would use the word, part of the natural cycle. So, one exercise I like to do is, if you think about any population, if it's going to be stable over time, each adult female needs to have one successful male and one successful female offspring on average. In other words, it's replacing itself. And, if an average monarch lays, and I think Karen knows better than me, but let's say 240 eggs, or maybe they lay some number of eggs, most of those as part of a natural cycle where the population is stable, not declining or increasing very much, most of them are going to die. And that's sort of part of the biology of the organism. And so, I guess my first point would just be that predation's a normal part of most organisms' life cycle, and for some it's a bigger part, and for some it's a smaller part. And just returning to an earlier question, a lot of the traits that we see and love about any organism, including the monarchs, have been shaped by those interactions with predators and parasitoids. Some very large fraction of caterpillars on their first day, monarchs on their first day, die in latex. I mean, depending on the plant species, it can be 30 to 40% of monarchs that hatch out of their eggs. They get mired in latex and they don't survive. Like, you might ask the question, is that beneficial? It's not a predator, but it's another big source of mortality. It's not beneficial for the population on the one hand. On the other hand, it's just part of that intimate coevolution or co-evolved relationship. And when the environment is healthy enough in general, that mortality by predators or dying in latex is, monarchs are food for the predators, and we want to keep the predators alive, and we don't want the monarchs to eat all the milkweeds. It's sort of a balance. So I guess the situation we're in is that monarchs are declining, as are many things. And the question is, should we try to take away one of the constraining factors like predators or latex or whatever? And again, like it being a sort of work with nature, don't try to manipulate it person, I would say predators have been an important part of monarch evolutionary history. There are some introduced predators like this Compsylura and others. I know that the introduced Asian praying mantis eats a lot of monarchs, at least around Ithaca. I can see them. So those aren't good or beneficial or part of the monarch's evolutionary history. Karen's going to need to clean up my answer.
No, I think your answer was perfect. Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's obviously not good for the single monarch that gets eaten, but we're interested in the whole population, and the thing that drove monarch numbers lower is not predators. So probably if we decrease predation, it's in the end not going to make that big a difference because all those other factors need to change.
Karen, was there some evidence for like a 15-year increase in predation in some of the MLMP data? I can't remember. And that's not necessarily that it's causing declines, but um,
So yeah, and we don't know. So the only thing we get a handle on is to can it fly
okay,
parasitism. We measure survival, and
okay,
survival can be due to many things besides predation. So um, yeah, we can't pinpoint predation
got it.
as
Okay.
I mean, I think that that's a great all-encompassing answer from both of you. You guys are trying to take all of your knowledge base and put it into a short, succinct answer, and I think you're doing an amazing job at sharing that. All right, so kind of leaning into the life cycle a little bit. Karen, I'll direct this towards you. There was a question from James Cully, and they were wondering, do males only copulate once and then die? And if so, why?
no. Males copulate, so that's what I studied for my PhD and several years after that. I had a champion male in one of the mating cages in my backyard who mated 21 times in his life, 19 days in a row. On the 20th day after those 19 days in a row, he died. So, no, males mate as many times as they can in their lifespan. So, on average, of course, the sex ratio is approximately equal. So, on average, a male is going to mate as many times as a female. But with males, we get a lot of variation. I mean, that 21 times mating, when you consider they don't live that long and it takes them all day to mate, that was a pretty amazing male. But so there's a lot of variation. There are a lot of males in my cages that never, like we went from 0 to 21. All the females would always mate, and you had a much tighter bell curve of the number of times that each female mated. So no, males will mate as many times as they can. That is what they are trying to do. Mate often. Mate often, mate fast.
Anurag, do you have anything to add there?
I have I have a question to add. I think I read in one of Karen's papers that the male does give a kind of a nuptial gift or we call it that, but a proteinaceous set of material with each mating that can be plus or minus 10% of the male's body weight. Is that
Yeah,
true? And so there is a big cost, and that
yeah.
20
So
times, like,
mating,
yeah.
right. So mating is, oh boy, I could go on and on about this for a really long time, but just a tiny bit. So if you think of a BB, that when the male mates with the female, he transfers sperm, of course, but he also transfers this protein-rich package that the sperm are in called a spermatophore. And the spermatophore goes into a certain organ in the female called the bursa copulatrix. And then the sperm move out of that across this little sperm duct, ductus seminalis, into a place where they're stored in the female, and then they're released one at a time to fertilize eggs. So that spermatophore, nuptial gift that the male gives to the female, the size of it depends on the age of the male. If it's a virgin male who's never mated before, he's just building up material in his ejaculatory ducts. So male monarchs have little tiny ejaculatory ducts, and Liz Gehring is here. She measured those, she weighed them for her thesis. So the material builds up in those, and then when the male mates, he basically transfers all of that to the female. So the size of that spermatophore depends on how old the male is. And then if he mates, it's small. So by the end, that male that mated 19 days in a row, he only was transferring sperm, nothing else with it. So yeah, it's super amazing. So it can be, so a male monarch on average weighs about 500 milligrams, and the biggest spermatophores could be 50 milligrams. So yeah, 10% of his weight. It's amazing.
We're gonna have to have a whole separate Q&A just on monarch reproduction. Probably need to throw some definitions into the chat there, but that's a great answer and also a great follow-up question. Thank you, Anurag. Okay, so they're males are mating. Obviously, females are going to be laying eggs. Anurag, is there what is the just expected percentage of eggs that successfully produce an adult? Do we know that?
Super variable. I guess, yeah, I don't have a number other than to say that many die early on due to host plant factors or like a combination of latex and shaving trichomes, especially on a hot day or under difficult conditions. And then most monarchs are also, caterpillars are eaten by predators. So, I think the survival rate that we get on a cut leaf in a petri dish or in a deli cup, is typically near 100%. I mean, not necessarily 100%, but very high, let's say 95%. But put that outside on an intact plant, even if you cage out predators and the survival rate might go down by 30%, open it to predators, and many times I can put on 10 caterpillars or 10 hatching eggs on a plant and not find one there 2 days later. So mortality is very high. And that's the way, what was it? Nature is red, tooth and claw. It's just the way it is.
Yeah, I bet a lot of people don't know about trichomes and shaving them. Could you just explain that, Anra?
Sure. If you look at my arm here, it's a little bit hairy. Um, and the common milkweed that, many monarchs eat, especially on the underside, has dense hairs. They might only be a millimeter long, but it gives the leaf a kind of grayish appearance on the underside. And they're dense. There are many trichomes, leaf hairs, per square millimeter. And we're talking about a tiny area. And when an egg is laid on a leaf, typically on the underside or on the apex of the milkweed, it hatches, 4 or 5 days later, depending on temperature. And the first thing it has to do is remove the hairs before it can put its teeth or its mandibles into the leaf to start chewing. Not all milkweeds are hairy, but the common milkweed is. And, the that caterpillar that at this point has only eaten its egg shell, that's the first thing they eat when they hatch, their own shell, which has protein in it. The next thing they have to do is kind of mow the lawn. They bite off those trichomes with their teeth, their mandibles, and they're not ingesting them. They're just moving them out of the way. And sometimes they'll clear a whole little round patch, and sometimes they'll clear a little circle in that first stage right after they hatch. But that's a real barrier to feeding for monarchs. And on some of the woolly milkweed, say in California or elsewhere, it's just, I'd love to show pictures sometime. I mean, it's like a little caterpillar in a forest of trichomes. It's a hard beginning for them in that regard.
Yeah, it's so interesting. Like I've loved reading all your papers on that. And one thing, monarchs don't seem to me, at least, to prefer butterfly weed, and that's a very hairy one. Although they, if they're on it, they work their way through all those hairs. I'm never going to forget arm hair. when I think of that in the future. But yeah, it's a cool thing that you studied. I guess the question about percentage survival, there have been quite a few studies, and like you said, it's super variable. But I usually say 2 to 5% make it to be adults. We had a graduate student in my lab, Alma Deonda, for those of you that know her, and she like totally carefully followed Monarch's survival. So she had daily mortality, and it's, daily mortality for eggs and first and second instars is about 12 to 15%. So that's every single day that percentage of them get eaten. So, and then it gets hard to track them after that. Yeah. So not that many.
Thank you for adding that context too about the milkweeds, and now obviously the hairy arm reminder in there. Okay, so here's kind of another question that relates a little bit to survival and success. Is there a maximum, and Karen, I'll direct it to you first. Is there a maximum temperature where monarchs would not lay any eggs anymore? And at what temperature would the instars suffer? So the larval stages.
All right. Thank you for asking this question. I have all these notes on the answer. I did research on this, but it was a while ago and I've kind of forgotten. So if you have this book, Monarchs in a Changing World, I had to reread a chapter that's in this book. So we had students in our lab, Kelly Nail and Reba Batalden, that looked at both the minimum temperatures for monarchs and the maximum temperatures for monarchs. And before we did this study, most of the research, I have to take off my glasses because I can't read my writing. Most of the research was putting monarchs in hot temperatures for their whole life, which is not very realistic because it cools down at nighttime. So we use temperatures of every 2 degrees from 38 Celsius up to 44. And just for context, 40 degrees is 104 degrees Fahrenheit. And 44 degrees is 111 degrees Fahrenheit. And we put them in those temperatures for 12 hours a day. And then we cooled it down at night to 25, which is kind of normal conditions in the like 70 or so. And we kept different ages of monarch caterpillars in those temperatures, and we kept them for different numbers of days in a row. So we were kind of simulating heat waves. So it was worse for the caterpillars if they were in these conditions longer, but like we did it up to 6 days. The most susceptible larval stage was third instars. They were the ones that had the most mortality, which was kind of interesting. But we had, compared to the controls, the monarch caterpillars survived just as well as the controls, so like the 95%, at 38 and 40. So up to 104 degrees, as long as it cooled down for them at night, they were okay. And at 42, we had very low survival, but some survival, and not a single one survived even 1 day at 44. So there's a cutoff between 40 degrees during the daytime. It's okay if it gets up to 104. And then you start getting mortality between 104 and 111 Fahrenheit. So there's the answer to that. For cold temperatures, and this becomes relevant when monarchs are overwintering, if they get pulled out of diapause and are in the Gulf Coast, like this year, it got super cold in Texas in the wintertime. And so, that's relevant for them if it gets cold. So, but they can get pretty darn cold. So the eggs can survive. So, there's 2 things you can measure with cold temperatures. You can measure when they actually freeze, when the tissues inside the organism freeze. That's called supercooling, where they turn to ice. And then there's mortality. And it was about minus 14 degrees so minus 14 Celsius is what, like minus, I don't know exactly what that is Fahrenheit, like 12 or so maybe. Anyway, a lot below freezing. We would start getting, so minus 14, we call it L50 when half of them die. And that's about when the eggs and caterpillars started dying, but they didn't actually turn to ice until it got down to, for the eggs, minus 25. So they can survive. They can survive. Now the question is, will their milkweed survive if it gets that cold? So we kind of think that for the eggs, if a milkweed plant freezes, if it gets really cold, if the eggs survive, the milkweed plant might grow back in time for those eggs to have something to eat. Like the fifth instars, they're kind of out of luck because they need food right away, a lot of food right away. So anyway, they can tolerate pretty hot and cold temperatures. The adults, we don't know. So what we know mostly about the adults is they become very inactive when it gets that hot, and they don't lay eggs, but they don't die. They do have a shorter lifespan, so it's like their life just goes faster when it's hotter. The other interesting thing, sorry, I'm just rambling, but I just read this paper, so you should all read it. So um, the other interesting thing is those caterpillars that were in the really hot temperatures during the time that it was hot, they just didn't eat. So that is, monarch caterpillars sort of can thermoregulate. Like if it's really hot, they'll crawl off of their plant and go into the leaf litter. That's why I worry a little bit about these, constraining monarchs on an outdoor milkweed plant. You're constraining their ability to move and to thermoregulate by moving somewhere different on the plant or even off of the plant. But in our experiment, these poor little caterpillars were in petri dishes like this. And there was a little piece of tape on top of the petri dish that said what treatment they were in. And they would crawl up to try to get in the shade of that little piece of tape that was on top of the petri dish. So they're trying to find shade, and that's kind of hard when you're in a petri dish. But anyway, they find the coolest place on the plant to get away from that heat that slows down. They just, when it got hot, they just didn't eat, but they didn't die. So the adults
That's
stop laying eggs, but it's just because they'll just find the coolest place they can go and sit and hang out instead of flying around in the hot sun.
wow. Also, negative 14 degrees Celsius is 6.8 degrees Fahrenheit. I looked it up while you were chatting.
Oh, thank
Can
you.
can
Thank you.
you reference what book that was just quickly one more time?
Yeah.
Somebody had just messaged about
Monarchs,
that.
Monarchs in a Changing World.
Perfect. Thank you. All right, we're going to switch gears a little bit from kind of life cycle and shift to migration. I recognize the time, but I do want to get through some of these other ones. And this is a question from Carol Elaine. This is an interesting question. The genetic, can you speak a little bit to the genetic contribution of the overwintering population on the Gulf Coast? She referenced Dr. Bill Calvert was working on this issue in Texas. So maybe just speaking a little bit to overwintering and just monarch populations in the Gulf regions.
My answer to that
Anurag
is we
or
don't
Karen?
know for sure. So that's a good example of, so the genetic contribution there, the genetics are the same of those butterflies that are overwintering along the Gulf Coast. So it would be really hard to tell if they have, if they actually move north with the other butterflies. They have yeah, so that's a big unanswered question. I know you think about this one too, Anurag. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I guess if we think about what I know, like there's um, populations in Florida that are sort of breeding year round, and there might be some that get stuck in the Carolinas or that breed again in Texas, or but I guess maybe to step back for a minute, just what you said, Karen, in an annual cycle of 4 generations where they are spending one of those generations overwintering, um, it's the kind of turning on and off or expression of genes that might change in one situation or another, but it's the same population that moves through the cycle. So there's nothing different about what we would call the sequences or the genetic sequences of the butterflies overwintering anywhere compared to not, but they are expressing more of some genes and less of some others that make their wings bigger, they invest more in muscles, um, and and so on. And so um, I guess the other thing to say, and I know the question wasn't really about Florida, but my understanding about, let's say, butterflies that aren't part of the bulk of the migratory cycle, but that take a detour and are overwintering or spending time in Florida or in the lowlands in Mexico, there are butterflies everywhere for much of the year. Uh, I think the current wisdom, and this is not my work, is that some of the migratory butterflies will find their way due to circumstance, chance, winds, etc., in Florida or in the lowlands in Mexico and will breed there. And some every year from those habitats will join the migratory cycle. And so what the genetic studies I'm aware of reveal is that there's not a lot of separation or distinction between the Florida or lowland Mexico breeding populations. There's a lot of exchange between them. And that's even true between California and Mexico. There was a incredible citizen science study, a person in Arizona that tagged butterflies in Arizona like every fall. And eventually, butterflies were found from his tagging in California and in Mexico. And in fact, there were some where it was like two from the same day. One was recovered in California and one in Mexico. So that's just to say that I think most monarch biologists think of the American population or the North American population, sort of Mexico and North, as being, we use the word panmictic, but largely all mixed up. Even if there's like, there's mostly California breeding or mostly Florida breeding, but then there's enough exchange that there's not real big genetic distinction. The last thing I'll say is I think there's like new evidence, and maybe it's not quite published, that the population, on Puerto Rico might be slightly genetically different or differentiated. It's been isolated, that it's a little bit different, but yeah.
Yeah, there's somebody else that had a question about that, the Hawaii. So you're right about that. I looked that answer up because it was somebody else's question, and there is a signal for Puerto Rico, Bermuda, and a tiny bit of a signal for South Florida, a
Nice.
genetic
Okay.
signal. But for the most part, the US, Mexico, Belize, and Costa Rica are all one big panmictic population.
Incredible. Just just overall, just very incredible to think about. Thank you, and thank you to Carol for that question. I have a question from Jen, and this is more kind of habitat related. How far can a monarch fly and recover without nectar? So basically, how far apart is too far to space patches of habitat for a monarch? Karen, if you want to start, or well, either one of you.
I don't think we know the answer to that question. And again, sorry, this is so unsatisfying, but it's always going to depend. Like if it's a southern wind and they're trying to migrate south, they might need the milkweed to be only a mile apart because, they're working so hard to fly and they're going really slowly. And if there's a north wind and they can just get up and soar south, they might be able to go 100 miles. But we know that monarchs in the fall, if you have plants that are blooming and that monarchs like, no matter where those are in the whole eastern migratory range, which I'm most familiar with, you will see migrating monarchs using the milkweed. So I think that we probably shouldn't be thinking of patches of habitat and how far apart they are, because if you have a patch here and 50 miles south, you have another patch. Who's to say the monarch isn't going to get blown a little bit east or west and completely miss that 50-mile patch? I think the way we should think about it is wherever we can, we should put in habitat, because they're gonna, some years and some days they're gonna need it really close together, and some days they might just fly right over it. I don't know, but
Yeah, the only thing I would add, and I don't, I'm interested in your thoughts on this, Karen, but I guess the lore from old studies is that during southern migration, as an example, they might travel 30 to 50 miles a day. Again, that's not using powered flight for most of that. That is mostly riding thermals and gliding. Somebody's estimate was if they were flapping, uh, they would run out of energy in 11 hours if they were using powered flight. Um, every afternoon, they're nectaring, in those fields of goldenrods and other things during the southern migration. Do you know, Karen, are they nectaring during the day much? Like if it's a clear day and they're off at 9:30 in the morning, is there any nectaring going on until 3 in the afternoon, or are they mostly in the air, like high up?
they're mostly in the air, but you will see them. And I think, again, that depends. If the night before, they might have had to stop somewhere where there was no milkweed. So, it's best for them to get there fast, not to drag out that migration. So,
Yeah.
on a day where the wind is blowing from the north and they can catch those thermals and move a lot, they're probably not going to come down to nectar, but they might need to, maybe they had to stop the night before without eating. So
Karen, when you
mostly
said
you
no
see,
milkweed, you didn't mean milkweed that they're using in the fall, right? During the
oh,
southern
did I
migration.
say milkweed nectar
Yeah,
plants? Sorry.
yeah. No, no problem. I
Thank
just
you
wanted
for
to, yeah.
catching that.
That's one of just my mantras is that during the southern migration, they don't need milkweed. Milkweeds
Yeah,
aren't typically
totally
flowering.
true. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, I
No, 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 I
misspoke.
just wanted to clarify. Yeah.
Thanks for catching that.
Thank,
Yeah. So
thank you guys. That's a great answer, and something you don't really necessarily think about per se, which way the wind's blowing and how far they are going to get to go one spot or another. So that's a great question. I'm gonna ask two more questions from ones that were submitted, and then I think we only have one question that's so far that somebody wants to ask live. So I'll give space to that person. And I'm gonna ask two of these kind of final questions here. And again, I recognize, guys, that we did not get to the 175 plus questions that were submitted. And we're doing our best. And I think we've gotten some really fantastic answers. And it's just great to watch both of you kind of see your wheels turning as you each are thinking about these questions as well. So switching gears a little bit. This is kind of a question that comes up often. It, of course, came up multiple times in what was submitted, and it relates to captive rearing. So this question comes from Kelly and also Frederick. So kind of pushing two questions together here. Is it best to let nature take its course, or do I collect as many caterpillars as I can to cage rear them? And to what extent does captive rearing affect migratory behavior? And Anurag, I'll go to you first.
I think it's best to let nature take its course. Outside of our research, I rear a couple of monarchs every year to watch the magic, and I think it's worth it to watch the magic and to encourage other people. We do school outreach events where there's a couple that are raised. Um, you know, monarch populations are declining, and um, I think of it sometimes as like, the water that's in a sink and the sink is draining, and something like captive rearing has the potential to add some more drops or some more water into that sink, but it's still draining. And I think that there's too many potential negative side effects of rearing, and too small a potential benefit of mass rearing. So that's sort of my thoughts about that. And what was the second part of the question? I'm sorry.
How does it affect, or does it, or to what extent affect migratory behavior?
Well, there's a study or two out now that shows that captive rearing can affect some aspects of migratory behavior. I guess, it's not really, I think the jury's a little bit out. I would just say on precautionary terms, or in terms of, it's hard to do a lot of rearing under natural conditions. And we know that the natural conditions are really important for both orientation, well, for developing the migratory form and physiology, for the orientation, and for reproductive diapause. And those are three different things. So I would say captive rearing has some probability of messing up either production of the right physiology, the adult migratory ability, or staying in reproductive diapause. And so for that reason, especially in that later generation, it seems like it's probably not worth it. Now, some people might say I can use outdoor cages, which has the right temperature and everything else, et cetera. But yeah, go ahead, Karen.
No, I totally agree. And I think we have exactly the same idea on that. And I just wanted to show, I rear monarchs too here. I collected a few today because I did a workshop. So little eggs here from Wisconsin. So yeah, I rear a few, but I think that I think that you aren't probably doing a ton of harm, except if you're doing in that last generation of the year, but it is not a way to benefit the population, because the decline in monarch numbers is not driven by the mortality. It's driven by loss of habitat, probably pesticide use, and by climate. And we're not fixing those things by rearing them. So, I maybe feel a little less strongly about the harm that could be done, but it's not what you would do if your goal was to help monarchs.
That's a good, interesting metaphor, too. I like the way you worded that, Anurag. So that's a great answer, and it also leads me to this kind of follow-up question. And it's from Stevie, and it's a great question. And actually, Kyrena asked something similar, and it's, how do we make sense of differing scientific opinions about data regarding monarch population status?
Oh, I think this is a fun one because Anurag and I have slightly different ideas on this one. So you should go first.
Well, I would say the decline of monarchs, is a super challenging problem because the temporal and physical scale is very large. We're talking about North America, Canada to Mexico, and we're talking about 30, 50 years. And so, unlike laboratory scientists, we can't do the controlled experiment. All we have is the data that we have, and it's certainly imperfect. So I would say, as painful as it's been for me a little bit over the last 10 or 15 years, it's been the appropriate scientific process that is, people put things out there, other people challenge them, there are replies, we change our minds sometimes, and it would be easier if the data were perfect or we could do the experiment, but we can't. And some of the things that we argue about are really fun to argue about, but they're largely unknowable. Yes, there were a lot of milkweeds in agricultural fields before the heavy use of herbicides. Exactly what contribution those milkweeds had to monarch populations, I think, is debatable. And on a kind of grander level, should we have milkweeds in agricultural fields, or should we maximize agricultural production? That's a more cosmic question. So I don't know. Like, I think science is what it is, and I think we do an okay job. It's slower than maybe many of us would like. Um, but I would say, the narrative has really changed in the last 10 years about the drivers of monarch decline. And it's not important who was right or wrong or what things have changed. I mean, I think the science has I've changed my mind some for sure. And there's just been a lot of work. There's been modeling, reanalysis of data sets, addition of new data sets. Um, I'd say we're doing pretty well. It's just not as fast as some of us would like.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. And I think just echoing what you said about it's difficult to measure them anywhere but in the overwintering sites. And it's even difficult in the overwintering sites in Mexico because all we can do is measure the area occupied by monarchs, but the density in that area is really variable from year to year and place to place. So it's hard to measure monarch densities. And I think the general consensus among the vast majority of monarch biologists is that the population is declining, and that it's declining to the point that it is at risk. There have been multiple population viability analyses published, which are basically trying to figure out how low can the population get before it blinks out. And obviously we don't know the answer to that, because I loved what you said about it's not bench science. We're doing a giant experiment with a sample size of one Earth, one North America that has monarchs in it, and we don't have a control that would help us have a clean answer to all of these questions. So, we're measuring something that's really, really difficult to measure. And we're measuring something as it's changing. So we're, where monarchs were, we luckily did a study in the year 2000 where we went out into cornfields, looked for milkweed, looked for monarchs, and then pretty much the milkweed disappeared really quickly. So the where monarchs are concentrated is really changing over time, but also from year to year. Like last year in 2023, so 2 years ago, we had a huge drought in the upper Midwest, and the northeastern part of the country had really pretty fine weather. So probably that year the Northeast produced a lot of monarchs and the Midwest didn't. So we're studying something that changes year to year and over time, which is difficult. So I would say the answer to that question is the general consensus is the population is declining everywhere. Or in most places where we can measure it, but the degree to which that's happening is really difficult to pinpoint.
Thank you guys. That's a really, first, that was a really great question. I appreciate that it came across twice in two different formats. Science is not perfect, but it helps us answer questions, and it takes time. And it changes minds, and it can change as you get new information and new data and things of that nature. So just a really great question to kind of not necessarily end with, because we have a few more minutes. I had one person that would like to ask their question live. So Gary Liska, if you would like to come off mute and ask your question to Karen and Anurag, please feel free.
Sure, it's Gary here. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yep.
Perfect. Alyssa, thank you for driving the ship tonight. You did a great job, and it's an honor to be here and to address the two experts. My question to each of you is, there was a public comment earlier in the year from I think it was the National Wildlife Service, and it was a public comment for, I guess, 90 days, looking for the perhaps reclassification of the monarchs based on some of the population density. And I was wondering if either of you had submitted your comment, and even if you haven't, what would be your comment as we all were able to write in and contribute to what we believe the status of the monarch should be, perhaps as early as later this fall?
Well, I'll jump in. Hi, Gary. Good to hear from you. I did submit a comment. And so, first of all, in my opinion, I used to teach conservation biology at the University of Minnesota. And I feel like the Endangered Species Act is one of the most important environmental pieces of legislation we have. It's a very successful law. Species that gain the protection of the Endangered Species Act are much less likely to go extinct than species that don't have the protection. So I think it's a successful law. And we have fairly good evidence that monarch populations are declining, and to a point where they could be reaching, a level that would make the population less viable. Um, so, so that's kind of one way to think about that question. But another way to think about that is, would gaining the protection of the Endangered Species Act help a species like monarch? So there has not been, with the possible exception of the rusty patch bumblebee, which is another one that was listed during the first Trump administration. Actually, the rusty patch bumblebee was listed as endangered. So it's another one that's pretty widespread. It can, show up in people's gardens. It's hard to define its habitat, but it was listed. But otherwise, generally, the species that gain the protection of the Endangered Species Act have really easily defined habitats. They're not so widespread. So that's kind of another way to think about that, is what could we do? So the proposed ruling has some critical habitat. All of that critical habitat is in California in the overwintering sites. We can't really pass a law that says we have to protect monarch habitat, because monarch habitat is everywhere. So I think giving monarchs that protection would be a really interesting exercise in conservation in the United States, because we'd have to think differently about monarchs. But I think as a society, we probably have the intelligence and the will, or we could, to do that. So, I think it's likely that it could probably help monarchs, but the jury's still out on that.
I'll just brief. I wrote my comment publicly in the Cornell student newspaper, the Cornell Sun. I sort of gave, and I'll summarize just in a few sentences. I mean, I guess, I think that, like, for conservation, monarchs are a funny or a awkward model, because there are hundreds of millions of them. I've been to the Galapagos Islands, Hawaii, once each. And the two times I went for, a couple weeks each time, the most abundant animal I saw were monarchs of these two places. It's a weedy butterfly. It is declining. Those two things are true at the same time. So I would say that if monarchs were listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act, I think the positive things would be that probably many species that are more at risk, or habitats that we want to conserve, would gain protection. And in a way, and I totally agree with Karen that it's really the most important environmental legislation probably in the world. The way the Endangered Species Act works is that it's targets individual species, but its goal is to result in functional ecosystems that those species live in. And monarchs share habitats with a lot of really important, less weedy organisms. I think if it got us to pay more attention as a society or to care more or to use the monarch's iconic status as like the Bambi of the insect world or the polar bear of the insect world, that would be a fabulous success. It's a little bit hard for me scientifically to make the argument that monarchs as a species need protection, in part because during the overwintering period, you can travel through thousands and millions of square miles of Mexico and just easily find monarch butterflies breeding in the off season in the lowlands. So it's a little complicated. The populations are declining, and they're not the typical conservation target, but they serve a very important societal role because of their identity. And for that reason, I sort of ended my comment with like, if they get listed, as long as I can keep working on them and people can keep enjoying them, I think there could be a positive outcome, but maybe not for the right reasons in terms of I don't believe there's any risk of extinction, for example, and we don't have to debate that or whatever, but just that may not be the goal anyways. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, Gary, for thank you, Gary, for unmuting and being willing to ask your question live in front of our group today. Appreciate it. I think it's a great question to kind of like wrap up and end on. I do want to take a moment. We're a little over time, and I honestly feel like that was a feat in and of itself. I want to take a moment again to just thank you, Karen and Anurag, for taking your time, sharing your expertise with us, being willing to spend your evening with us across many states across the U.S. and Canada. I think we have some folks on from Canada as well. So I really just want to take a moment to thank you again and being willing to answer these questions and have this conversation. I think it's important for us to continue to engage with one another, continue asking questions. That's what science is all about. And that helps us learn more. And I want to thank all of you for joining us today, for taking the time to register, for taking the time to provide your questions, even though we may not have gotten to it. Just you being here, you learning, you continuing your learning, that is just part of conservation. It's part of science, and ultimately I think really helps and will continue to help our monarch butterfly population. So thank you guys so much for joining us and taking the time. I do want to just say one more time, if you would like to continue to support opportunities like this, please see the links that Jenna is putting into the chat and consider making a donation to the Monarch Butterfly Fund or the Monarch Joint Venture. Your support to any nonprofit organization like us and the Monarch Butterfly Fund really allows us to continue to provide these opportunities, as well as on the ground conservation efforts and support research and things of that nature. So just thank you again. And I hope you all enjoy the rest of your evening. And just one more huge shout out and thank you and applause to Karen and Anurag for sharing your decades of work as it relates to monarchs and beyond. So thank you guys so much. And thank you all for joining us.